My primary interest here is an older now NSF project we had on identity and engagement in computer science. The broadening participation angle was around women at that point, but we would certainly like to redo it and cast a wider net.
Should I jump in? So my name is Marty. I'm a student with Hamza. We're both fourth year doctoral students at UMass Dartmouth. My main interest, well, my background coming to this, and obviously there's a lot of background given the wrinkles and gray hair. I come from sort of a business and psychology background. I did a lot of survey research and analysis. That aside, my interest here is in actually how really little kids learn math and how fundamental concepts are formed or not formed and are helpful or problematic. And a topic near and dear to my heart is how picture books can be used effectively to help little kids enjoy and actually learn math.
Hi, everyone. My name is Wen. I'm the PhD candidate in the University of Arizona. I'm from Teaching, Learning, and Sociocultural Department, and my research interest is about how technology can support teaching and learning in the classroom. So I'm on my dissertation proposal stage. One of my task is to design some learning activities for online digital course for undergraduate students to examine their digital literacy practice in online environments. So I'm very looking forward to hearing more about collaboration and which can spark me how to design some learning activities which ask people to collaboratively complete the digital project in online environment. Thank you.
Hi, sorry. My name is Karen Chen. I'm an assistant professor from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I am broadly interested in how we can use data and technology to support students' self-regulated learning in K-12 to older kids, like in undergrad.
Did everyone have a chance to introduce themselves? Great, I'm Sarah Hampton. I am a high school math and science teacher. I'm also a leader in educator circles, and I'm going to be your technical facilitator today. Please let me know if you have any questions or difficulties. I'll do my best to help. This is the top things to know about motivation and engagement session. And it is an expertise connection session designed for leaders in the circles community who have expertise around this topic to provide, number one, information and examples for those who have a particular interest in it. Two, to provide a forum for participants to share how they might incorporate this into their own work. And three, to broker some connections within the circles community around this topic. So as you go through the session today, I hope you think about what you can take with you to the strategy session tomorrow as we make a plan for how we can remake broadening. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dalila.
You're muted, Dalila.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. So just welcoming everybody and asking Sarah to please share our presentation for today. Sarah will be advancing our slides and keeping us in check today. Our speakers today, Dr. Matt Bernanke, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Dr. Sydney Mello, University of Colorado at Boulder, Dr. Akisha Horton, Indiana University, and myself, Dalila Dragnet-Cindric from Digital Promise and Circles. Next slide, please. We would like to start today's, next slide, please. We would like to start presentation today in our engagement in this session by doing a brief Jamboard activity. You will see this link for the engagement and motivation session Jamboard. And what we would like to do is basically just have you pick a sticky note and give us your thoughts on what's your working definition of motivation and engagement. Please note that there are 2 tabs on this Jamboard. So once you have completed the first one, where you will give us your definitions of motivation and engagement, on the second one, we will ask you to please tell us how would you broaden your existing definition to include an equity and diversity lens. And then if your definitions perhaps already include an equity lens, please share with us what is your current approach. We would love to learn about that. So we will just take several minutes to do this activity, and Sarah can explain briefly how to actually edit a sticky note.
You can either double click on the sticky note itself, or you can click on the upper right-hand corner. You should see 3 dots there, and then select edit, and you should be able to type right in. And as soon as you close that kind of pop-out screen, you should see your words on the sticky note itself.
Thank you.
And Billy, you just let me know when you're ready for me to go back to the slides.
Thank you. I would just give it a couple more minutes. Maybe we could advance then to the next board.
Sorry.
I think if people are perhaps ready to talk about what we entered on our sticky notes, we could maybe just take a couple of minutes to look at the first board where we had our definitions, and then briefly look at our expanded definitions or way to expand the definition. So if you can just see, Sarah, maybe the first board. So we can see many definitions here. We can see motivation is learners' drive to learn something or drive to engage in an activity or task, or willingness to keep persisting. And then with respect to engagement, we see that it has multiple dimensions, that it's an act of purposeful connection with others and resources. Are there any others that somebody would like to read off or discuss or highlight before we move to the second board? I was just grabbing randomly some of the statements that I saw. Sarah, what stands out to you as a teacher?
Just the themes of it's the drive. It could look different depending on the learner, but it's sort of that if they're motivated, they're going to find a way to keep at the task, even if they don't like it, maybe.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else that would like to share? Okay, if not, we can take a quick look at the second board. I'm just briefly reading here, and I can see that we kind of seem to agree that broadening would require us to be more purposeful about recognizing the cultures, the backgrounds, and the experiences of the students. And then also to expand the set of constructs and structures that may facilitate or hinder engagement of our students. Okay, is there, would anybody like to say anything else or highlight something else before we move on to the first speaker, keeping these definitions and especially our expanded definitions in mind? Okay, if not, Sarah, can we have the next slide? I will turn it over to our first speaker, Matt Bernacki, who's going to speak about top things to know about motivation. And as we go forward, keep in mind this Jamboard activity and some of the definitions we just entered there. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Dalila. And Sarah, I'm a bit of an over-animator, so you can probably just give me 3 clicks here since we each gave ourselves about 5 minutes. And I want to make sure that we kind of situate all this into the idea of broadening. And that's why I start with a 0 rather than a 1, where theories of motivation are multiple. Motivation is not one single thing. And all of the different theories related to motivation arise from earlier lines of study in psychology, when the focus was not on equity, nor on broadening, as we've come to understand about kind of the psychological tradition. And this has been a more fairly recent development that I'll talk a little bit about and Akisha will expand upon later. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So if I were to try and give just kind of like a quick listicle of top things to know moving forward as you consider motivation alongside your primary areas of study, it's not on-off. It's not simply extrinsic or intrinsic. I've been to a number of NSF panels where we cross education and social science with computer science and other places where there's work to be done to acknowledge the breadth of motivational theories and kind of the messiness with which they interact. So you can jump to 2 and 3 here, I think. Let's see, I think 2 clicks will do it. So those theories are numerous. They overlap and they interact. So it's a little bit messy where there's probably maybe 8 or 10 main theories, and they've got different words for the same things or the same words for different things. So there's a little bit of jingle jangle to navigate. And there's also some soft edges where students' beliefs start to enter into their motivations, and their emotions that follow when people are learning are also included in some of these models. So it's a little bit messy, but if we were to build kind of a working toolbox of motivation, you can give me about 3 clicks or so. We might start to build that toolbox with this idea of self-beliefs. So people's kind of self-concept about themselves as a learner, particular to a task, the kind of mindset they might have towards their beliefs about their own intelligence, their ability to grow it, their epistemological beliefs about knowledge itself and the way that it's built in its nature. We'll also have some task-specific beliefs about one's efficacy to complete a task successfully, their expectations that they will, and the kind of values they believe a task to have. Those are all kind of in a social cognitive model and an expectancy value model. And that all of students' engagement is theorized to be driven by their goals. So we have these achievement goal theories about students' interest in mastering content, self-improvement, performance goals, which are about optimizing one's performance and outperforming others. And then 2 more clicks. And then we have kind of one more big theory, self-determination theory, that really focuses on the learner as an active agent who needs to feel competent and connected to their peers to thrive in a learning environment. And these are kind of the core ideas within motivation theory, but those also nest in other theories that include cognitive processes and metacognitive processes, or models that include students' emotions during learning, and the regulation of all of this. So emotion regulation, motivation regulation, and metacognitive self-regulation or self-regulated learning. So it's a fluid space. One more slide, I think, that gets at kind of the messiness within motivation within a task. So probably 3 clicks or so, because I'm running out of time. We've got this idea of kind of slow twitch processes that are developmental, and maturational fast twitch ones, which are reactive to events that happen during learning. And then this idea of dynamism, where motivations combine and interact. So 3 more clicks will show us that like combinatory goals of wanting to master and perform lead to something different than either of those goals independently. And then expectancies and values interact in these theoretical models. So 1 more slide after this. It's usually a self-report phenomenon. 1 more click will show you an overly complicated slide to capture the challenging decisions, 2 more, that people have to make about how do I measure before a task and after a task, periodically within a task, or pinging people during specific moments during that task to try and get at that momentary, granular, or kind of macro sense of somebody's motivation on any one variable. So there's a lot of ground to cover here, and we're only now thinking through a lens of understanding not only the learner, but all varieties of learners. Last slide. And this is where just in the past few years, you can see by the dates here, there's been a call over the past decade to kind of broaden the lens to acknowledge kind of the beyond just invariance in our measurement approaches, group invariance and individual differences, where we can come to kind of re-image the way we think about all these motivational constructs, to have more voices to tell us what is value, what is cost, and how does it differ by the individual experience, and how that leads to this more situated and more person-centered understanding of motivation. All right, that was roughly 5, and I'm very happy to pitch on to the next slide, and folks can start talking about engagement that follows.
Can you hear me okay? Great, thanks, Matt. That was wonderful. So similar to motivation, I thought I'd just share a few things about engagement. So one just comment from looking at the definitions that we had, you can see that there's no clear definition and it's all over the place, right? And so let's just think through a couple of options. Just as Matt said, that engagement is motivation is just not on or off. Many times engagement is used as on task or off task. So putting aside the question of what does it even mean to be on task, engagement is more than just on and off. So here are some, next slide, please. Here are some vignettes, and I'd like you to think about each of these and think about, would you consider the student engaged? What would you say about the student's engagement? Next click. And one more. So here's one. Keisha attends math class each day, listens attentively, asks good questions, and completes her homework. She considers math to be her least favorite subject, even though she recognizes its importance in her future. So if you had to look at this and judge this, think about the student and make an assessment on the engagement and perhaps even motivation, what might you say? Let's contrast that with another student. Next, please. So Raphael attends every math class, sits silently, takes detailed notes, and always completes his homework. He really enjoys math, but what he's passionate about is science, and he wants to become a biologist. And this is another student's profile. And we'll look at one more. Marcus is passionate about math and plays math games in his spare time. He attends every class, but finds the material to be too easy, so he gets bored. He tries to complete his homework every night, but finds it too tedious, so he posts on social media instead. And here's a student who is you would call this under-challenged. So in each of these profiles, I hope one distinction that I want to draw is that engagement, like motivation, is multiplicative, multi-componential, and involves trade-offs and competing factors. So some of those, next slide, please. One of the things that we do know is that engagement has the behavioral component, cognitive component, and affective component, and that's an emotional component. And even within those, there are different subcomponents. For example, one part of the cognitive component might be being able to self-regulate your learning and use more sophisticated learning processes. But another one might just be not letting your mind wander while you're learning. It's much more primitive attentional component. Similar to engagement, more recently, people have been looking at the student's agency and thinking about engagement. There's a new form sometimes called agentic engagement. And I think this is where we can start to think about engagement from a more diverse perspective that doesn't consider a one-size-fits-all group and more of a traditional model of education where students sit silently and do their work and do what they're told and do their homework, but engagement as being a more culturally and a different, manifesting differently for different students. Next slide, please. Next click. One other thing to note is that engagement also is embedded in space and time. When we think about engagement, and this is studied by different schools of thought, when I study engagement as a cognitive scientist, I study it mostly from this very person-oriented component. We shut out the world and we focus on a person and their behaviors in very, very short time frames. On the other hand, if I was a sociologist, I would study it from the context of the school and the school system and the educational system. And that's what we call a context-oriented perspective. The variables there are very different than the variables you'd study on one side. And lastly, you may think about it as the person in context, right? This is kind of, I think, a sweet spot. This is me in a classroom with a teacher and a curriculum and a culture and a da-da-da-da-da. And how does engagement emerge? And the important point to make is that they all have something to say, they all contribute differently, and there's different methods to study engagement in each context. Next slide. Engagement also can be measured, I just want to point out, quite precisely. Again, the self-reports are a classic way to do it, but there's also observations through video coding or live observations and looking at behaviors. One of the nice things about engagement is it is manifested in behaviors. You can look at things like click streams, you can look at eye tracking. Next slide, please. You can automate engagement measures, just so we don't have to perseverate on this, but what you see on the left is the model. It's just an approach on how you may automate them. On the top, you see one study in our lab where we actually use eye tracking in classrooms. Students learned with an intelligent tutoring system, 30 students at a time to track engagement. You can also do it through other things like facial expressions and body movement. So there's a way, it doesn't all have to be self-reported. They can all complement each other. Next slide. Engagement varies with a learning activity. And this is Mikichi's ICAP framework, interactive, constructive, active, and passive, with the general idea that more passive activities are generally low engagement versus more interactive. What's important to note is that the same activity can apply at all levels. So something that you may think as being extremely passive as listening to a lecture could actually be made very interactive. Is after you listen to it, you have to argue a position in the lecture. So the actual activity is not passive, active, constructive, interactive. It is the context surrounding the activity. So something that could be, so it's important to think about when you're designing things, you can think you're superficially engaging somebody, but actually mapping it's what is going on in the head and what are people doing, rather than just the modality that matters. I think last slide. And one last thing I'll say is that in terms of engagement, is we always struggle with this tension between liking and learning. To the left, you see one of the domains I work with my colleague Val Shute. It's an amazingly engaging game. People love playing this physics game. They love it. But it's hard to squeeze out formal learning from these games. It just is. On the other hand, the top is the tutoring system we developed for biology, and they learn, but they kind of don't love it. It's very traditional. And you see the bottom in ITS, they kind of don't love that either, but there's learning. So being able to navigate these two is something I just feel the field has, in my opinion, has yet to crack meaningfully. And last slide. So if you wanted to learn more, I would direct people to the Handbook of Research and Student Engagement. That's a little, oops, sorry, one back. Thank you. That's a little dated. It's 2012, but it's a wonderful volume. More recently, OECD has put out, this is the Organization of Economic and Cooperative Development. It's they put out this book. It's freely available online. There's a lot of chapters on engagement, motivation, and so on, and looking at kind of learning in this new era. And I had a chapter there on improving student engagement in and with digital learning technologies, where we fleshed out some of these ideas more. So thank you so much and we'll look forward to having a discussion soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Sydney, and thank you, Sarah, for advancing the slides. So studying the multidimensional nature of engagement becomes even more complicated when students engage in small group work. Although the collaborative work is becoming more prevalent across school subjects, most of the motivation research focused on individual students. The current research on motivation and engagement actually shows that we shouldn't be assuming that putting students into small groups and working with peers is going to promote individual motivation or to be beneficial for group motivation, engagement, and the learning outcomes. In other words, we really shouldn't expect that students will work together just because we have assigned them into small groups and asked them to work collaboratively. What we know from research is that learning in small groups may sometimes actually undermine rather than foster individual motivation. What this means is that learners in small groups experience multiple challenges. They can experience challenges ranging from cognitive to socio-emotional challenges. What we know is that successful small groups have to engage in social regulation of learning, in regulative processes that actually help them navigate through the experienced challenges. Next slide, please. So how do we actually get to this productive collaborative engagement? What we know is that productive engagement starts with positive socio-emotional climate. In other words, it seems that successful collaborative groups start and then work very actively to maintain a positive socio-emotional climate. Small groups engage in 3 different modes of social regulation of learning. We see students enacting self-regulated learning, co-regulated learning, and then socially shared regulated learning. Co-regulated learning is a mode of regulation where a student in the group temporarily might guide another student. For example, somebody is looking at their phone. Somebody else says, hey, stop looking at your phone, work with us. So that would be a temporary guidance, and then the other student just reverts their attention and starts to work with the group again. These small groups engage in processes of planning, monitoring, controlling, and evaluating their learning. And then with each of these processes, they can target behavior, cognition, emotions, motivation, and even the environment that they are in. all of this leads to solid, successful social regulation of learning. And finally, to the productive collaborative engagement. I think one thing that I would like to point out is as we think about broadening and how do we get to equitable student engagement, is that this mode of regulation that I mentioned called socially shared regulation of learning is when we see groups engaging jointly and equitably in regulation of learning. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about group socio-emotional climate. What we know from groups that have positive socio-emotional climate is that these groups are the groups that engage in that equitable mode of regulation of learning. We see more frequent and higher quality socially shared regulated learning. These groups spend more time on task, and if they engage in help seeking, we see instrumental help seeking, which means this is the type of help seeking that fosters their learning. Groups with negative socio-emotional climate have more instances of self-regulated learning and lower quality socially shared regulated learning. We see instances of complete disengagement, and groups tend to engage in maladaptive help seeking, meaning if they ask for help, somebody else like a teacher, it's to get to a very quick, correct answer and basically have an excuse to quit their work. One of the things I wanted to share with you is about off-task engagement. And Sydney touched on this. What does it mean to be on task or off task? Much of the research actually has excluded from analysis instances of off-task engagement when groups seem to be off task or students seem to be off task. And they have focused only on cases where groups are working on the task. Although it's excluded from analysis, we are learning that actually off-task episode may play important positive role for the unfolding group dynamics, the group's regulation of learning, and finally for their learning outcomes. Next slide, please. And I would like to leave you with just sharing with you a framework that brings together motivation and engagement. This is the motivation and engagement wheel from Andrew Martin. And the reason I wanted to share this is because it alerts us to the multiple dimensions and aspects of motivation and engagement that we need to consider as stakeholders in education. This is a framework that could be useful to us as researchers, but also to us as parents who might be considering, how much our own children might be engaged or disengaged in different situations. So Andrew Martin actually had 4 higher order factors in this framework. You see adaptive and maladaptive behaviors, and then maladaptive and adaptive cognitions or motivations. And then there are 11 first order factors that contribute to each of these higher order factors. So that, again, this is something that might have quite practical use and has been tested in different situations and disciplines. So just wanted to leave you with something that has a practical application. And with that, I will turn it over to Akisha.
Thank you to all my colleagues who've spoken before me. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the importance of equity for student engagement and motivation. Next slide, please. So I guess my argument is that we ask our students to think in new ways. I work in a department of informatics, computing, and engineering. And so I'm always working with faculty who are asking students to learn a lot of new terms and rethink frameworks and processes that they may already be engaged in, and to think of those things through a socio-technical lens. So how society is impacting technology or vice versa. And so we ask our students to become a part of that struggle that includes challenging the disciplines that they're in, be it computer science, engineering, or informatics. But this is the wonderful part. If we ask our students to think in those new ways, when we have them engaging in the disciplines, then we can have faculty think about the new ways in which they can address racism and equity in their classrooms. And that includes through active learning and different strategies for group processes. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about mindset and the study that was done by faculty at Indiana University in the Psychological and Brain Sciences Department. I believe I have that correct. And can you go to the next slide, please? And so in this study, there was 150 faculty were surveyed from 13 different STEM departments, and 55.3% of those were tenured faculty, and the average amount of teaching experiences that they had was 18.4 years. And so that's the demographics of the people who were surveyed. The faculty were surveyed, and then students were also surveyed. And what they did was they added a few questions to the end of the year survey to get the student responses. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so in that study, they found that the all STEM students, especially underrepresented, or as I call historically excluded students, which includes minority students, women, and gender fluid students, people from low socioeconomic statuses, they all believe that they performed better in classes that were taught with a growth mindset. Can you go to the next slide, please? So what does that mean? That there was a two times racial achievement gaps over classes that had fixed mindsets. And so what we mean by fixed mindsets are faculty who did not believe the students had any agency or the ability to change. It was like they come into the classroom and either they get it or they don't. And this was in response to surveys the faculty took. Whether they felt they were teaching to the best students and those other students just weren't trying as hard, and that was on the student, as opposed to faculty who thought about the course as having skills that were malleable, which means that they could develop them and help students develop them over time, and that instructors could help guide that process of development and especially address bottlenecks in the discipline. Can you go to the next slide, please? And so what it means is that they had this mindset that they could help all the learners, and I will help you learn. And things they would do is like provide a checklist to guide students through the elements of complicated projects or papers. And these are just a few of the strategies that they use in the class. There are several different types of strategies that you could use. And one thing was real simple, where I say it's free help sessions as opposed to using the term office hours, because some students come from a background where office hours are only for emergencies, where they have to talk to a faculty member, and they don't think that they should talk to a faculty member because they're not the ones who handle they only handle emergencies. And so they just kind of struggle in silence in some cases. Can you go to the next slide, please? And when we talk about engagement, students that don't feel like they belong really struggle with engagement in the class. And what we mean by belonging is a basic human need and motivation, that they feel that they should be in that classroom. And I can speak for personal experiences. When I was doing my master's degree, I've had faculty members literally asked me in the middle of class, why did I think I belonged there, and had me answer that question when they didn't ask that to any other students in the class. College students experience and report a sense of belonging as a feeling of fit, inclusion, and relationship with others in their academic and social context. And so, and if you feel like you belong, then you want to take chances and be okay with possibly answering a question incorrectly, as opposed to if you know people are expecting you to answer a question incorrectly, or you feel like that, then you may not want to engage in the materials that are in front of you. And that's just one context of this. It's a lot more to belonging, but we only have a few minutes. So next slide, please. And so, and I've already discussed why some of these reasons why belonging is important and some of the research behind it. Next slide, please. And so, I think the key thing that I want to take out of this is that a sense of belonging we remind students as we're working with them that adversary is universal. Everybody experiences it, even if you can't see them experiencing it. And it can be temporary when we're talking about getting through a class or getting through a program. And so if we help students develop a sense of belonging, especially students that are from historically excluded groups, we can see those performance gaps close or at least lessen. And we can see attendance improve, retention rates go up, and long-term performance. And that's all I have right now, so we can move to the next activity.
So we were planning to have a breakout room activity, and I have a question for my session co-leaders. We have 4 participants, and we were planning to have 4 breakout rooms. So I don't think that that makes sense. The question is, would you like us to just stay and have a discussion as one group? Probably that would be the best, rather than try to split up. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
So
would it be good to encourage questions now?
Yes. So I would encourage everybody, if you have questions, if there are things we could elaborate on or maybe discuss a little bit more closely. One of the things, if people don't have anything specific they would like to ask, maybe we could talk a little bit more about this discussion about what it means to be on task and off task and who gets to decide. That's something that I always think about, and where does that place the power? Who has that power to make a decision? Who's on task and off task? And then how do we go from there to facilitate productive engagements in the classroom?
I actually have a kind of maybe a more specific technical question that,
Sure.
that Sydney's presentation made me think of, because I come from more of the experience sampling background. But try to broaden it out from there. But I was just in measuring the constructs of engagement. So I know how to do it in the experience sampling framework, but is there any research that has aligned or correlated, say, eye tracking or facial expression with other traditional measures of engagement and find them to be highly correlated, or find that they're measuring different things?
Yeah, thank you. The kind of standard way this is done, and just to give you a context, in the context of an online learning environment, these are kids learning math with the online platform. And as they are learning very traditional videos, problem sets, we actually give them experience sample questions. So, how content are you? How bored are you? And so on. And then later on, we looked at their log files. This was behavioral patterns. For example, what are they, are they clicking videos? Are they answering correctly? Just those few things corresponding to those experience samples. And the correlation in that case was about, the best correlation, the average correlation was about 0.25. Now that might not seem like a lot, but if you think about an ESM that's asking somebody about how bored they are, you're getting at all kinds of things. You're getting at emotion, you're getting at tiredness, fatigue, they hate their teacher, they love the teacher, they hate the subject, so on and so forth. And so we are encouraged by a modest correlation of just looking at one behavioral channel. And the correlations do get better if you add a few things, if you're looking at the behavioral clicks as well as eye attention and so on. So there's work along those lines.
Okay, yeah, I'm pleasantly surprised that people are looking at that.
Yeah.
I have a question for Akisha. For several years, I did a pretty in-depth unit right at the beginning of the school year on growth mindset, but then I started reading more and more articles about how that can be misconstrued as a deficit mindset, so I stopped teaching it. Can you talk a little bit to that and what you recommend?
Okay, well, when you say deficit mindset, what exactly do you mean?
Sort of what Sydney was talking about in the earlier session, where he discussed words like grit or those charged words that kind of underline or underlie the meaning of what you might be saying. Okay, and so I know grit is associated a lot with what Dweck was saying, and so I know I've read specific articles about how that can be misused and misinterpreted. So I kind of put that to the wayside.
Yeah, and so I would refer back to what our speaker, Dr. Washington, spoke to in the keynote today, and how she talked about the idea that the language where you separate out from growth mindset, the idea that you focus in on instructor talk when you're talking about growth mindset. And what I mean by constructor talk is the language that is used that doesn't deal with specific pedagogical processes. And so when you start thinking about that in terms of growth mindset, and I can give you 3 articles to speak to that, and there's a lot more out there, you talk about different behaviors that take place in the class to set the social tone for the class. For example, and can I share my screen real quick? And let me go to
if you can't, I can make you co-host so you can.
Okay. Oh, I can. Let me see, share screen.
If you can't, you're now so.
Okay, I think I can. I think it's letting me share it. And so when we're talking about, within growth mindset, I think about the conversations related to micro affirmations and microaggressions, and thinking about how we use language when we're encouraging or discouraging certain behaviors in the classroom, certain pedagogical practices, and certain approaches to thinking about how we are in the classroom. So for example, when we think about how a professor might frame an idea of, so there are several different categories and subcategories that a professor that you can identify as instructor talk. So for example, if you say something like, all right, I shared from our class about how you guys kind of didn't do well on the assessments last week, but that's okay, we can always improve. Now that talks about the context that grit doesn't necessarily play a role in that, but but it's more about thinking about, it's more focusing in on what happened.
Malleability.
Right, accountability, versus sending a message about whether or not you want students in the class. So we'll see if this is our new class size, if I've managed to scare people away, or this is just people being tardy. So thinking about within the mindset, thinking about how language is used within the mindset in order to actually encourage a growth mindset, if that makes any sense. So like, for example, let me see if this will come up. And when I approach this, I always make the argument that faculty, at least I'll say 99.95% of faculty, always have the best intentions of their students when they're talking, but they may not always understand how their students are perceiving what they're saying. And so, for example, a quote like this one, for example, all right, so the volume is dying down, which leads me to suggest that we are about to start talking about what happened over the weekend rather than the assignment. So let's see what we came up with. So what I'm gonna do is start picking on people in class to answer that question. And so the goal of this is to get a conversation started, to have an understanding of what people know as a result of working in their groups, but what the language that is being used. So what I'm gonna do is pick on people, sends out a message that's somewhat aggressive, and letting people know that I'm going to pick on you. I'm going to really dissect perhaps what you're saying, or look to see who looks like they're not paying attention, who's not prepared, who's not ready. So I'm going to pick on you to make sure that I make an example out of you. What exactly does that mean? We don't know. And so when I think about growth mindset, I also talk about it in terms of being careful with the language that we're using. So when we talk about grit, we talk about it in terms of what is actually reasonable for the students. And so it's because I think what is meant is that you want to inspire students to do their best, but also recognize that there's a balance in how is there some things that students have no limits on, like, for example, there's one quote in here about the book is expensive, but it shouldn't be an issue. Just have your parents pay for it. And so thinking through what do you actually mean by grit?
Okay.
And what do students have agency over that? I hope I didn't take too long to answer that question, or and that I did address the question correctly.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm glad to know I don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there was a lot about that was appealing to me that I kind of put by the wayside. So I'm glad to know that I can bring those salient elements back in.
Yeah, just one more framing from kind of the teacher perspective and the instructional design perspective. There's been a lot of embracing of the ideas of things like grit as a way of kind of endorsing that students need to dig deeper and work harder, rather than to acknowledge that grit doesn't mean the same thing for everyone based on that kind of initial point. And I think that much of the conversation about why it induces a deficit perspective is kind of framed within those kind of implementations that are really problematic, because they kind of, let off the hook the system and push it back on the student again, which, can double down some of the old habits under new terms, which kind of makes it even worse. So.
And Matthew, based on what you said, again, my approach is to work more so with faculty to help faculty think through these challenges, as opposed, or instructors to think through these challenges, instead of if grit is what you're aiming for, how do you help students develop the type of grit that you're looking for within a reasonable means, based on what you know about that student, which means you have to know something about that student. And you need to know what the parameters in which you can work, the zone of proximal development with which you can clearly push them within, which by getting to know them and engaging with them, you can, especially at the K through 12 level, you may have more time to engage with them than you may in a college class, but you can take time to get to know them to understand what grit would mean for them.
Thank you.
I think we have only 1 minute left in the session. I would just like to thank everybody for participating, for my co-presenters, and then for attendees. Thank you for finding the time to be here with us today. We really appreciate it. And Sarah, thank you for facilitating the session. I know you have a closing script that you have to get to, so I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Just a reminder that we did reschedule the welcome and announcements for right after this meeting. So you can access that from swap card, just go back to that main session. And then a secondary reminder that we are gonna have some informal meet and greet time through the Wander platform, beginning at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, 3:30 Pacific. And then if you can't make that informal meet and greet tonight, that's no problem, but make sure you do join us in the morning for swap card at 10 a.m. Pacific, 11 Mountain, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, wherever you might be, for another great day of activities where we really get to work on what it means to remake broadening, and share that in concluding with the town hall event with the NSF officers tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.